Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. I hope you are well. I wanted to go over a story that I think will, at some point in time, impact all of our lives. And that is taxes going up. And you may say, oh, George, I don't make enough money for my taxes to go up. Oh, but yeah, you do. Because let's remember that inflation is the most regressive tax that the world has ever seen. It disproportionately affects the poor and middle class. So even if they're not saying they're going to increase your taxes, they are. Trust me. But let's go into the mainstream media really touting this and how they are making the argument, if you want to call it that, for raising taxes on the rich. And it's just amazing that this is just a panacea. It's a silver bullet for everything. Well, if only we could just raise the taxes on the rich, then all of our problems would be solved. And it's just such an elementary way of looking at things. It's just such so ignorant and naive. But let's go through this article, and I'm going to point out why this is so naive and why it's just utter nonsense. So this is from Jacob Lew, and he served as Treasury Secretary. Looks like under Obama, or it looks like he was under Trump for a year there too. Imagine you're out to dinner. Well, let's just read the top of the title here. How to get the wealthy to pay the taxes they owe. So right off the bat, it's starting from a premise that entrepreneur. Let's call a spade here. Who are the wealthy? And you can say, oh, well, George, a lot of these people inherited money. Okay, sure, fine. That's a very small percentage. The majority of the quote unquote wealthy are entrepreneurs who started a business, who create goods and services. They create jobs. They are the growth engine of the real economy. That's the that's the bottom line. There's no getting around that, no matter how the people at CNN or Mr. Liu wants to spin it. But let's get into his argument here. And right off the bat, it completely falls apart. So he's saying, imagine you are at dinner. At the end of the meal, you pay your bill, which helps the restaurant meet their costs, their food costs, rent, wages. But some customers slip out without paying. They disappear into the night. Oh, I love that, right? So entrepreneurs and producers, job creators are these just kind of devious people that are just slyly walking around, just hiding behind corners, like twisting their mustache, and they only come out at night because they're just so slimy that they're trying to get in and out. They're trying to dine and dash without paying. And he try to sets the image as though these people, we shouldn't trust them because they're disappearing into the night. Scary. They're probably disappearing into the night because they're getting back to they're going back to the office to work a 16-hour day to sacrifice what needs to be sacrificed to create more jobs and goods and services. So the economy as a whole, so society at large increases their standard of living. That's probably why they're disappearing into the night. But they leave the business to pay the same expenses with a fraction of revenue. So what he's saying, or what he's attempting to say, is that all these rich people are going into a restaurant but they're not paying at all. They're not even paying a dime. They're just giving them a check that bounces, or they're just slipping out the back door into the night, into the shadows. It's like he's portraying this image of like Mr. Burns and Smithers sitting at a Olive Garden and ordering everything on the menu and then just walking out without paying. But right away, you can see how disingenuous this is, and you can see all the intellectual errors that are being made. And this is why it's so hard to take people seriously that have this view. Because even when it's examined by a 10-year-old, they can sit there and say, wait a minute, that's not what's happening, Mr. Liu, at all. Let's remember that the top 1%, call it, or top 5% or so, they're paying 40% of the taxes. 40%. So let me give you a better example. Let's imagine that you're all at a restaurant and the price, and everyone gets the same meal. So the price is the same. Well, let me back up here. So the meal is identical. Regardless of who's getting it, you get the same food. And then the people there that are quote unquote rich, the entrepreneurs, the risk takers, the producers, they are asked to pay $100, in which they go ahead and pay. And then everyone else is asked to pay $5 for the meal. And let's just assume that some of those rich people take deductions. So therefore, they only pay $95 for the meal instead of $100. Mr. Liu is implying that those people that paid $95 didn't pay at all, or they didn't pay their fair share. They just snuck out the back door into the night, into the shadows, never to be seen again. And they leave all of this burden for paying the bill on the people who only paid $5, when in reality, those people actually paid $95. They didn't sneak out anywhere. They paid almost 10 times what other people paid for the exact same meal, the exact same services from the government. So by looking at it through that lens, you can see that what he's saying is completely ridiculous. It's not even a good example at all. It doesn't even make sense. And what he is implying is that people should pay a percentage of their income for that meal. So let's back up here, use the same example. You all get the same plate of food, but you all should pay 10% of your annual income for that plate of food. So if you're making $1 million a year, then that plate of food should cost you, whatever, let's just say 10%, $100,000. Where if you're making only $10,000 a year, then that same plate of food should cost you $1,000. And if that person who's paying $100,000 has some deductions, well, then they're not paying their fair share. That's how he's trying to that's the reality. But he's trying to spin it to make it seem as, number one, the entrepreneurs and producers are bad guys. Like, they're always lying, they're cheating. The only way they have more money than someone else is because they got it through immoral gains or a lack of ethics. The only way they have more money than you do is not because they took more risk, not because they created jobs, not because they created a good or service that the market values more than the dollars they have in their back pocket. It's only because they lie, cheat, and steal. That's his starting point and his framework for looking at the entire world. Well, we can see how flawed that is just when you look and step back, zoom out, and realize that those people that he is demonizing as cheats and thieves and people who are morally bankrupt, those are the people who are really driving the economy forward. And without those individuals, I would argue that we'd be in the Stone Age. If it weren't for those individuals, that 1%, and I'm not talking about the people that have the 1% of the wealth, I'm talking about that 1% of those entrepreneurs that start the businesses and that do well, they drive society forward. And if it wasn't for those 1%, we'd still be an agrarian society. We'd probably still be in a feudalistic society. It's those individuals that created the Industrial Revolution. It's that 1% that goes out there and they create the technology that we enjoy. They create the jobs, they create the goods and services, and that lifts up the entire society. It just goes back to Adam Smith and the invisible hand that moves the market. Let's keep going here. Mr. Liu is not done with his insanity or his propaganda. It says, this is what's happening to the government. Each year, hundreds of billions in taxes owed goes unpaid. And this tax gap leaves fewer resources to pay our country's bills. Most working people whose employers deduct taxes and report incomes they pay what they owe. Okay, let's back up here. Yes, they pay what they owe. I would argue that they overpay. Most working people don't take the deductions that they deserve. And does the angelic IRS sit there and say, "Oh no, no, average Joe, you could have taken a few more deductions, so we owe you more than you think we owe you"? No, the IRS doesn't make that phone call. If you overpay, they gladly accept, right? And this is something that Mr. Liu completely ignores. That when they do these studies where they talk about the tax gap, what they do is they just look at how much they think they should have received and then how much they did receive. But what they don't do is calculate how many people overpaid. They paid too much, and what demographic, what group actually paid too much. And I would argue that, okay, although you may think, IRS, there's a tax gap, and that some people could be cheating on their taxes to create that tax gap, that the tax gap would be even greater if people weren't overpaying. And I would argue, too, that if you actually look at the numbers and take it as an aggregate total, I'll bet you we don't even have a tax gap. So what I mean by that is they're just looking at the people that they're just looking at a select group of taxpayers and saying, well, we should have got this amount of revenue, but we got under that amount revenue. And they probably excluding the whole rest of the individuals that paid what they should have paid based on the IRS's calculations. But you see, the group that they omit, and this is my opinion. This is what I would assume based on a lot of personal dealings with the IRS. I would assume that they completely omit collecting data on all the people that overpaid. And I cannot even tell you how many entrepreneurs I know personally that have overpaid dramatically on their taxes. So why do they do this? Because number one, they don't know any better. And then after they get after they get knowledge that they overpaid because of some error, maybe an accountant or something like that, they're just like, screw it, I'm not going to deal with it. Because trying to get that money back, it's not worth the time, the energy, the hassle. Let me give you another story. My brother-in-law, I won't go into it, but he played professional sports for many years, and he pays a ton in taxes. And he got a bill from the IRS one year that was roughly, I think, $5,000, something like that. And he talked to his accountant. The accountant said, no, you absolutely do not owe this. This is a mistake on their end. The IRS made a miscalculation. And so my brother-in-law said, okay, well, what should I do? And the accountant said, well, unfortunately, here's your option. You either pay me $10,000 to fight it, and you most likely win, or you just pay them $5,000 and let them and just accept the mistake and just overpay them. But even if you overpay them, you're still saving $5,000 because to fight it again costs 10 grand. So what did he do? He just wrote the check. Overpaid, willingly, knowingly overpaid, just because he didn't want to deal with the hassle. And that's my point. I think that if you look at the aggregate total, that because they're just focusing on the group that didn't pay enough, but they're completely omitting all of the people that overpaid. And I think what I'm trying to say here is if you look at the aggregate total, I would argue that IRS probably receives more money than it is actually due, but they're just cherry picking the data. And I want to be clear, I haven't done any research on that. I'm just gathering that from just anecdotal evidence that I have with pretty much every single entrepreneur that I've ever known that is a taxpayer. If they do anything, they overpay. It is disproportionately very wealthy people who find creative and sometimes illegal. See there again, he's just throwing that out there to try to make it seem like all these rich people are evil. And the only way they become rich is by lying, cheating, and stealing from you. It's this very, it's just like looking at a pie chart. Like you can't expand the pie. Like it's a zero-sum game. And what they get away with in part because the IRS lacks the resources to go after them. As part of the plan to rebuild the IRS after decades of decline, after a decade of decline, President Biden has a sensible solution. Require financial institutions to report additional information about taxpayers, which the IRS can use to determine who might be evading taxes. So this is the law that you guys have been reading about, where for I don't know how long, the IRS makes the banks report any transaction over $10,000. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. But now the Biden administration says they want to take it down to $600. So any transaction of $600 needs to be reported to the IRS. And I like this. The requirement would be straightforward. An additional burden on the banks would be minimal. Oh, really, Mr. Liu? How many banks have you owned in your life? My guess is zero. So anything the government does by creating bureaucracy and red tape, although the central planners think or like to think that, oh, yeah, that's no big deal. And then the next thing you know, we get FATCA, which is such a massive big deal, which is such a huge burden in the form of paperwork that most banks outside the United States won't even accept American customers because they don't want to deal with all of the additional restrictions and all of the additional paperwork. It's just not worth it for them. So think about how much additional burden it would be for these banks to, instead of reporting transactions over 10,000, reporting transactions over 600. And Mr. Liu is sitting there saying that it wouldn't be that big of a burden. Come on. And then it's total annual inflows and outflows for each account. So this is maybe something in addition to reporting the $600 to an existing form that they already provide to the IRS. Individual taxpayers would not need to do anything, and no detailed transaction data would be shared. Oh, come on. Yeah, that's as though we're supposed to believe that. Reporting this data is so critical because it gives the IRS a heads up when a taxpayer's true financial position is reflected in aggregate account flows, differs from what was reported. So let's just think this one through. We've got this law that takes the transaction amount down to $600. Is that going to affect a billionaire? Is that going to affect someone who is worth $100 million? How many transactions do they have other than just in their personal account, just buying groceries and whatnot? And they're not. I would highly doubt that they're trying to skimp on paying the taxes for just the money that they use to consume on a daily basis. Very difficult to hide that, and the juice isn't worth the squeeze when you look at the penalty. Even I don't care if the audit rate is 1%. It's just not worth it at the end of the day. If you're someone that is this rich, why would you risk that, right? Why would you risk cheating on your taxes for the money that you use for daily consumption? Now, I get it. If you've got like a $100 million windfall, then there would be an incentive to lower your tax rate as much as possible. But that's when you're talking about $100 million transaction. That's not dealing with a transaction for $650. I mean, that's utterly ridiculous. So who would this affect? Well, it would affect most of you on this live stream right now. And that's the problem here. See, they like to make this out as though it only affects these billionaires that have just had all these ill-gotten gains. When in practice, it's just like the TSA. It affects all of us. And it affects the average Joe, the average Jane. And I would argue that it'll probably affect the poor and middle class in a disproportionate level than it actually affects the rich. Now he starts talking about how according to him, the rich evade taxes. Third-party reporting independent information that helps the IRS to verify tax returns increases tax compliance from under 50% to over 95. And let's just think this one through. If you overpay, are you tax compliant? I mean, there's an argument that maybe you're not. I mean, what are they using for these numbers? Where are they getting the data? I mean, to think that 50% of taxpayers are non-compliant, insinuating that they're underpaying, no chance. No chance of that, if you're being honest about the data. For the wealthiest taxpayers, income often falls outside of existing reporting streams. Now, notice he says income. The single largest source of the tax gap is low visibility income, like royalties or capital gains. I mean, how does this guy have an ounce of credibility? Just FYI, Mr. Liu, capital gains are not income. If I have my shares of uranium, as an example, if they've quadrupled, that's a paper gain. I don't have any income. I don't have any more dollars, cash dollars, on my balance sheet than I had before. That's not income at all. It's by definition, it's capital gains, therefore not income. So, what's amazing to me is that people can read this article and take this guy as though he is some sort of authority, as though he actually, and what I mean by that is that he actually knows what he's talking about, where he just contradicts himself, not only in the same sentence, but in multiple parts of the same sentence. For anyone that has some common sense, don't you think they would scratch their head and say, wait a minute, this guy's just doesn't know what he's talking about. He's contradicting himself. Therefore, should I really buy into what he's saying, or should I be a little more skeptical about it? And that's, it's just hard for me to get my head around how people can just read this stuff and just take it as though it's gospel, when it's just blatantly trying to manipulate you, and it's blatantly false. As much as 1/5 to half of this income goes unreported. So again, he's talking about this income, meaning capital gains, which isn't income at all. And where is he getting this number, by the way? 20% of that isn't reported. And also, how would what he's talking about increase the likelihood of people reporting capital gains and the sale of a house, as an example, or that would have been captured with over the $10,000 most likely as well. And if you have a capital gain for under that, then again, you're casting a net, really not really on the rich people. You're more so casting that net over the poor and the middle class. Then he goes on to say, with neither sufficient staff nor a clue where to target its audits, the IRS is about as likely to audit a low-paid worker who receives earned income tax credit as a person in the top 1%, even as the amount at stake is much lower. This is an outright lie. Think about that. You're sitting here telling me that the IRS isn't going to choose who they actually go after. You think that it's just some sort of random lottery that, oh, shoot, well, I got unlucky there. I got an audit from the IRS, but that was obviously random. I mean, they didn't select me. It's just, it's like winning the lottery, but in reverse. It's the same likelihood, but yet you lose instead of win. This is utter nonsense. And let me give you an example as to why. In 2009, I believe it was, I was audited. Well, 2010 for 2009, I was audited. Okay. And why was I audited? Because I had a significant loss in 2009. And so I took that and uh, did what they call a carry back, or I was going to carry it forward. But bottom line is I had a loss that I took that bounced up against my taxable income for other years. The IRS didn't like this. So they came in and they wanted to audit me because the amount of the loss was so significant. So was that them just randomly picking me out of the 350 million people in the United States? I just got unlucky? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's the IRS. They understand they can't audit everyone, so they're going to audit the big fish. They're going to audit people who they want to make an example of, or they're going to audit people that they think the juice is going to be worth the squeeze. They're not going to audit some McDonald's worker. I mean, for all of you that are on this live stream right now that have had an experience with an audit, or one of your friends has been audited, how many of those people made under $50,000 a year? I mean, honestly. And then he goes on to say that this somehow disproportionately affects minorities. So, how many minority McDonald's workers do you know that have been audited by the IRS? And let me continue my story, because once we went through the audit, we came to the conclusion that they actually owed me more money, that I overpaid. And they didn't like that at all. So what ended up happening is maybe 6 months later, after that audit, I get a letter from my accountant saying, "Oh, you're not going to like this, but they're auditing you again for 2010." And they audited me again for 2011. And every single time, they didn't like the result of the audit. So what do? They just kept auditing me over and over and over again. 5 times. 5 times. And every single time, they had the audacity to tell my accountant that this was completely random. Completely random. It's just luck of the draw that your name came up 5 years in a row when they audit 1%, according to them, of the American population. And there's 350 million people, let's just say 250 million taxpayers in the United States. What are the odds that they audit one person 5 times and that it's actually random? I'll tell you the odds of that. 0%. So I'm here to tell Mr. Liu that he has his facts wildly wrong, and I can prove that just with my own personal story. Okay, so where I want to go with this is giving you guys the ability to cut through the BS. And I think that most of you in the Rebel Capitalist community have a pretty good BS meter. But in today's day and age, I don't think there's anything more important, because you're just bombarded with BS right and left. Whether you watch a movie, whether you turn on ESPN, whether you're reading some blog post from CNN, from some guy who sounds like he should know what he's talking about. I mean, he's the Treasury Secretary, right? But then you realize, if that BS meter is finely tuned, that the only thing he's doing is spewing nonsense and propaganda. So let's learn from the greats. How do we cut through the BS? Well, let's see, right here, let's go to one of the greatest of all time, and that would be Dr. Thomas Sowell. He says there are 3 questions that would destroy most of the arguments on the left. Now, he's kind of obviously a conservative guy. He's very political. I shouldn't say he's very political. I think he's criticized the right on many occasions as well. But I don't know that we have to isolate this just to the people that are on the political left. I mean, there's several people on the political right that are just as bad, if not worse, than some of these crazies on the left. They're all politicians at the end of the day, and I don't think you can trust any of them, or maybe you can trust just a select few. But I would say that this is how you destroy most of the arguments that we're seeing today by the central planners and the Marxists. I think that's a much better way to say it in the context of what we're dealing with in the world today. So the first question you have to say is compared to what? You see? So they come out and say, well, this plan would be better. This plan would be great. Or we want socialism as an example. We want more socialism. We want a greater welfare state. And you say, okay, well, that's one direction we can go. Let's compare that to the other options that we have, such as free market capitalism. You see, or a world in censorship would be, or a world, let's go back to that Benioff video. A world with censorship would be so much better, just so long as I'm the one that's doing the censoring, right? Okay, compared to what? Compared to Stalinist Russia? Maybe. But compared to a free society where we can all make our own decisions, and in a society where we're not living in a 1984 novel, then the alternative could be more attractive than what is being pitched by Mr. Benioff and Klaus in the World Economic Forum. And here's another great one. At what cost? And this is something that is completely over the head of most people who argue for medicine mandates. They argue for more government intervention. They argue for, let's say, a no-fly list for planes. Or they argue in favor of what is happening in Australia right now. So they say, oh, well, it's all for the benefit of health. It's all for the benefit of security. Right. But let's ask question number 2. At what cost? At what cost? That's what they completely ignore, especially when we're talking about the cost of giving government more power and control over your life. Then third, and this applies to this article we just read from Mr. Liu, what hard evidence do you have? See, Mr. Liu has quote unquote facts that are just being spun, and that's if he has any facts at all. This is very similar, in my opinion, to like the wage gap argument, that they say they have facts that might, okay, fine, you've got facts that women make less than men, but once you scratch beneath the surface, you see that those facts are completely misconstrued, and they are bogus when you look at them on an apples to apples comparison. So I think that this tax argument for wanting to get the IRS more involved in your privacy and the relationship you have with your bank, I don't think there's any evidence that would back up that that's going to move the needle at all, especially when they're coming from a standpoint of MMT, right? In MMT world, if we don't have inflation, you don't need taxes. You don't need to sell bonds because the government is a currency issuer, right? They're not a currency user. So that's the irony here, is that we're talking about taxes. Not only do taxes, would that just pay for the government for 2 weeks, if that, but based on their ideology, their economic ideology that they're espousing, we don't even need taxes in the first place because inflation is transitory. So let's hear Dr. Soul in his own words.
Questions that I think would destroy most. I've often said that I think would destroy most of the arguments on the left. And the first is compared to what? The second is at what cost? And the third is what hard evidence do you have? There are very few ideas on the left that can pass all three of those kinds of things.
Okay, and just to clarify, guys, I would say that there are very few ideas from Marxists and central planners that would pass those 3 questions. So in the future, whether you're watching my video or you're just watching, if you're punished by watching CNN or having to read something in the mainstream media, and ever you hear an argument from one of these clowns, just ask yourself those 3 questions, and that'll really help you cut through all of their BS. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We'll see you on the next video.